Hello. Today we are working on data representation passages. This is one of the three types of passages you will see on the ACT Science. These passages um, are typically come in twos, so you'll usually see two every test you take. Um, they're very easy to identify because what you will see is that the passage will just have a small summary and then it'll go straight into diagrams and charts and tables and graphs. And what I want to show you today is how I approach the data representation passages. What we'll notice is that there are a lot of charts. I actually don't even go into the summary, and I'll show you why as we move through this. But the first thing I wanted to do is let's actually take a look at it because just for science passages in general, you will see a trend with specific things. Um, a lot of the science passages will have heavy science jargon, which means that you'll see things like pigmentation is a very big science word, deer mice or its genus species name. We don't necessarily need to know that that is a deer mouse. We just need to know that those two correspond to one another, or I need to be able to identify those words. And so when you look in here, you can actually just read through this and it'll literally give you a summary of what the experiment or the research that they did presents. Okay. So scientists compared the brightness of the fur of mice from populations located different distances directly inland from a coastal site. Figure 1 shows the two facial regions and the two body regions at which the fur of each mouse was evaluated on a scale from 0 to 1.0 with respect to its brightness. Figure 1 also shows how, for each of the four regions, average relative brightness varied with inland distance. Now, as you see, it just gives you a brief summary, but I want you to take a look at the first diagram. The first diagram here is of a deer mouse, facial regions, body regions, rostrum, cheek, dorsal stripe, ventrum. That picture tells me everything that this just said. Looking further, my graphs also give me a bit of information. And what I would do here is I would ask you to think about, what do you see? What are the things that you see? And when I look at a chart or a graph, I start to analyze it right away. The first thing I look at are one, titles. What am I looking at? And so this is the rostrum, dorsal stripe, cheek, and ventrum. I knew that. I know what those are because it's related to the wording up here. I don't necessarily need to know exactly where that is. I just need to know that it's there and it connects them. The second thing I look at are my axes. So the first thing is my independent. The independent axis in this case is the horizontal axis. So as you notice, they're all inland distance measured in kilometers. All of them. Third thing I look at would be my dependent axis, which is my vertical. The vertical axis, or the dependent, tells us the average relative brightness. And again, for every single one of these graphs, it's the exact same. Even the scale is the same. The fourth thing I look at, which I kind of do as I go through my each axis, is I look at units. I already mentioned that we're measuring inland distance in kilometers. Average relative brightness doesn't really have a unit, but I know that it grows from 0 to 1 by 0.25s. The next thing I look at is what we call scale. Another idea of this is domain versus range. And I've already been talking about this because we mentioned that it goes up by 50s. The x-axis does, and it goes up by 0.25s on the vertical. So these are the things that we've already covered. And I'm doing all that in one shot. And then the last thing I look at is the trend. After I know what the graph is showing me, I want to look at what the relationship between both of them is. So as in general, what we can see here is we usually have a downward trend. Okay, it kind of goes up for them as space increases, right? We had a little bit of upward movement here, and even at the end here. But overall, the trend is pretty much downward. And what I'm thinking of at this point is that the further inland I go, the darker I am. The further inland I go, the darker I am. Or another way to think about it is the closer you are to the coast, the brighter you are. Okay? And that's how I'm breaking this down. We just took a few minutes to do that, but realistically, this is a 15 to 30-second exercise. Read through the titles, know what your independent and dependent axes are measuring, look at their units, find the scale of or the domain and range of each axis, and then look at your trend really quickly. We have a second figure in here as well. Again, I'm not even going to read this stuff up here. I'm going to go straight to the graph. And I notice really quickly, again, titles, no title here. That's fine. Second thing, independent axis. We have inland distance in kilometers. Again, I'm looking at units. I'm also looking at my scale. It's already from 0 to 150. Same exact thing. The difference for this one is the dependent axis. It's average percent of relative reflectance. Okay, this one goes from 0 to 100. A little bit different. Not 0 to 1, 0 to 100, but still by 25s. We want to make sure we see that because the decimal matters. Another big thing that I would probably point out here is on both of these graphs, you have an asterisk. The asterisk will always be shown below the graphs, what it represents. And notice how I'm not reading through that right now. I'm just noting it. There's an asterisk. I want to make sure I can look at that place because I might be able to find some answers in there. But again, at face value, that's all I'm really doing. And so from there, let's go straight into the questions. With data representation questions, a lot of the time they will point you exactly where to look at. They're asking you to look at the graph, look at the chart, and determine a value. And so that's what I'm going to do here. So on question 1, it asks, based on figure 2, on average, where was the brightest surface soil found? Figure 2, right? Where is the brightest surface soil found? Well, just thinking about the problem, you're either inland on the coast or you're on the coast or you're inland on land. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is it's probably going to be brighter on the coast, but let's check it out. So figure 2, that means we're going up. Figure 2, average percent relative reflectance. The brightness is the highest here. It is the highest here. That's where the most reflectance is, which means that is where brightness would come from, right? Shows how the average brightness of surface soil. So it's got to be at the coast, which is exactly what we thought would be, because that's where sand is. That's not where dirt is. Question 2. According to figure 1, the average relative brightness, that's our dependent variable, of the dorsal stripe was 0.25 at an inland distance that was closest to which of the following. Notice how I'm highlighting important information here. It's mentioning dorsal stripe. I know that's important because we have 4 different parts that we're looking at. It also gave me a number, 0.25. I'm recognizing that because I'm probably going to look at the average relative brightness at 0.25. And what we're going to look for is the distance, the inland distance it was closest to. Okay, pause real quick. Another important factor to look at whenever you're taking the ACT are your answer choices. Everything is measured in kilometers. So if you're measuring off of your y-axis, you know that's not going to be the right value because kilometers is always measured on our independent axis for these graphs. So let's find the dorsal stripe at 0.25. Well, the dorsal stripe is here. 0.25 reflectance, or relative brightness, is here. And if we go straight across, we notice that it hits at an inland distance of about 60. And if we look at our answer choices, that is appropriate. I'm pointing this out because it should be that easy. It can get overwhelming because they're throwing a lot of jargon at you, but go to the dorsal stripe, look at 0.25 on your average relative brightness. What is the kilometer measure that goes along with it? Very straightforward question. All right, number 3. According to figure 1, the greatest change in the average relative brightness of the fur on the rostrum occurred between which of the following inland distances? Again, greatest change. Whenever I'm looking at greatest change, my mind automatically goes to slope. And very specifically, the greatest slope would be the steepest slope for the rostrum. And so where did it occur? Note that we're going between two values. And so we're going to go back over here to the rostrum. And I'm going to look at which part has the steepest slope. And I think very obviously it has to be this portion right here. That looks like it. And so we notice that it starts from about 50 and goes somewhere else, 75, I would think. But that would be the steepest slope. That's the greatest change. And so I would find that value from 50 to 75. Looky there. Question 4. Based on figure 1, on average, was the fur pigmentation of the ventrum of our mouse lighter or darker 150 kilometers inland than it was at the coastal site? So before I even look at this, I'm still looking at ventrum. It's essentially asking us, was the fur lighter or darker when we were at 150 kilometers inland than it was at the coastal site? Well, again, just thinking through logically here, the coastal site is brighter. The inland distance or inland places are darker. So we're probably going to be darker here. And note how the answers are written here. This is a very typical style of ACT. Lighter, lighter, darker, darker. Right away, we should be able to eliminate 2 of them. You must pay attention to the comparison. The ventrum at 150 kilometers inland versus at the coastal site. Well, inland you should be darker, so I'm going to go ahead and eliminate G and F. If we follow this through, because the average relative brightness 150 kilometers inland was greater, or because the average relative brightness of 150 kilometers inland was less. So it's either going to be less or greater. Again, it's just logic here. I need to eliminate one. Well, if I'm saying it's darker, that doesn't mean that it's brighter, right? Which is what H suggests. So J has to be our value here. Darker because the average relative brightness 150 kilometers inland was less. And again, let's prove that to ourselves. Just by logic, we figured out this answer, but let's go back and prove to ourselves in figure 1. So in figure 1, we go to the ventrum, and we look at average relative brightness at the coast versus inland. And we notice really, really quickly, you have an average relative brightness of 1 or 0. It's clearly darker when we go inland. All right, number 5. Which of the following statements best explains the geographic variation in the fur pigmentation of the mouse? Okay, so it's asking the question right away. Which one of these best explains it? And then it starts off the explanation. This is important. You must use their explanation. We cannot change the stuff that's in here. You have to use it. Let's read it. At any given inland distance, the more closely the fur pigmentation of a mouse matches the soil. Okay, so if fur matches soil, then what happens? Okay, and again, we have our setup. Less likely, less likely, more likely, more likely. Okay. Less likely the mouse will be found by a predator. Well, if their fur matches, I would agree to that. Less likely the mouse will be found by the predator. More likely a mouse will be found by a predator. More likely a mouse will be found by a predator. Just off of that first statement, I'm going to go ahead and eliminate C and D, because if you match your surroundings, hence camouflage, you're less likely to get eaten. And thus, the less likely it will pass its fur pigmentation traits off to its offspring, less likely. And thus, the more likely it will pass its fur pigmentation traits to its offspring. Well, if you're going to survive because of your traits, this is just pure evolution at this point. you're more likely to pass on your traits. Note that this is not from the graphs. This is prerequisite knowledge. You have to have a basic understanding of evolution, of camouflage, of how evolution works. Number 6. Based on figure 2, on average, was the surface soil at the coastal site lighter or darker than the standard that was used for comparison? The standard. Okay, we have no idea what the standard is because we haven't read into anything. So we're going to go to figure 2. We're going to try to figure out what the standard is. So up here, doesn't say anything standard. I'm going to glance or skim really quickly. It doesn't have standard anywhere written there, but down here it does with your asterisks, compared to a standard that was assigned 100% reflectance. Well, 100% reflectance is up here. We don't start until about 70. So even at the coastal site, we're below the standard. Everywhere we are below the standard. And so I want to just figure out which one that is. So again, we're doing our comparisons. Was the surface soil at the coastal site lighter or darker than the standard? Well, it's darker. We know that right away. So lighter, lighter, darker, darker. We do it's darker. So F and G are gone. And then it's just about understanding how the explanation works. The average percent relative reflectance of the soil at the coastal site was 100. Well, that's not right. That's the standard, right? We started at around 70. And the average percent relative reflectance of the soil at the coastal site was less than 100. Yeah, it was less than 100. So I'm going to go with J. So the last thing I want to point out here is that we didn't read anything. We took the time to go through this, but realistically, you should be able to identify those parts. And then furthermore, I just want to show you something. Everything that we highlighted in green on the passage is where the answers were. So in a graph, 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 in the asterisk. Okay, which again, we didn't have to read any of the passage. There wasn't much of it, but we didn't really need to understand anything. With data representation, this is pretty much the standard. You don't have to read into anything, and if you do, I would suggest skimming for vocabulary. So I look for the word standard. In this case, it worked really well, and it tended does do that. So the last thing to talk about here is, one, you have questions that are asking you directly go to the chart, look at it. And then the other style of question that you're seeing here are comparisons, right? I'm going to give you a statement. You either know it's above or below, and then I will have a follow-up reasoning, and you have to make sure that that reasoning fits the statement. And that is data representation passages. Identify them. They have no experiments or studies. It is a short passage with lots of graphs, diagrams, charts. I suggest not reading it. I suggest going straight to the questions after you have looked over your graphs, which should take about 15 to 30 seconds. You should be able to move pretty quickly here. All right. Do your practice, and you can watch the next video where I will be breaking down the other forms of science passages. Thank you.